All right, I guess we are already started. Hopefully everybody can see us. Victor, can you see my slide?
Yes, I can.
All right, perfect. So we will get started and hop right in. Um, we've got a good audience. I think people are still trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. And really appreciate everyone's time for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Before we jump into the content, just want to quickly, do a little housekeeping. So we're going to do a webinar today. Please, everyone's muted on the call, but if you have questions, please just enter them in the Q&A panel in the Zoom webinar screen, and that will allow us to kind of view your questions, and we will get to your questions at the end of the webinar. And look forward to viewing and answering those. So without further ado, let's get started. We're going to discuss sort of the margin gap, or gaps in this case, that most fuel and convenience retailers really don't have visibility to and aren't able to prevent in their P&L. And so we've got a few scenarios to run through, but before we do, we'll do a little bit of introduction, both about myself and Victor, and also LEAFIO as a company. So I'm Brad Mirtchler. I'm the Vice President of North America here at LEAFIO. And, I've got a number of years of experience in retail and supply chain. And I'm really focused on helping clients both in North America and all around the world to leverage technology to increase their KPIs, automation, et cetera, in retail. And then, Victor, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, hi, my name's Victor Hart. I'm Senior Account Executive with LEAFIO and have experience for many, many years working in supply chain, specifically focused on retail operations and helping retailers get better results, better business value out of all of their supply chain operations. And looking forward to walking through some of the scenarios today with you folks and hopefully enlightening you on some opportunities to improve your business.
Yeah, Victor and I both talk with retailers around the world all day, every day. I mean, this is the role that we have, and so um, you know, sort of the structure of the webinar today is to talk about some of the challenges that we see specifically in convenience stores, retailers dealing with, and so we'll go through that. A little bit about LEAFIO. So LEAFIO, we're a software provider. We implement solutions all around the world. We're in 40 plus countries and have 250 plus projects, 15 years of experience, et cetera, which really allows us to leverage our expertise and help clients in the best way possible improve their supply chain and merchandising process. When we think about that, we offer this unified platform, the LEAFIO AI platform, and there's a lot of modules, what we call modules here. Today in our webinar, we're specifically going to be focused on more of the inventory optimization side of the platform, but wanted to take a quick look at all the things that we do, just to orient our audience for a little bit about our company. So let's start in the upper right-hand corner of this. We offer, on the merchandising side, assortment performance, which is really answering the key question for our clients. What should we sell and where, right? It's probably the first and most critical question that a retailer has to ask themselves. And so we use, uh, you know, data-driven AI to make decisions and recommendations based on the assortment at the store and cluster location for our clients, along with much more. Once we know what we're selling and where, we have to make a decision as retailers. How should we visually merchandise these products in our stores? And so that's where our shelf efficiency, planogramming module comes into play. So it's creating automated planograms based on, company strategy and best practices. Um, it's measuring the results of those planograms, offering suggestions, et cetera, and then critically helping with compliance, both via our mobile app so that store managers and store employees can track the success of implementation of planograms via AI image recognition. So now we've answered the question, what do we sell? How do we visually merchandise it? Then we move over to the supply chain side. And now we have to make the decision, okay, I know what I'm selling. I know how many facings and where it is in the store, et cetera. How do I replenish it appropriately so that our inventory in the store and in our warehouses is aligned with my demand across my stores in my entire network? So we have, demand forecasting, automated replenishment, and much, much more on the inventory side as well. We have a lot of functionality around fresh goods, which we'll talk about today, promotions, machine learning forecasts, so on and so forth. And we're going to go deeper on this side today, so you'll learn a little bit more. So that's a little bit about our platform. In terms of who we serve, we serve clients in various industries, and I really like this view of our clients because we've got some great, beautiful clients that are, globally recognizable names. But I think really the important takeaway here is that, we work with all kinds of retailers, grocery, convenience store, where we'll focus today, is one of our biggest segments, liquor, pet, pharma, DIY stores, and as well as some CPG and distribution as well. So, a very broad focus in terms of industry, and we're really going to focus on, the gas and oil space today, where we have many, many clients using the products. All right, so that's a little bit about us. Hopefully, everyone's still awake and engaged in our webinar. We're going to get to the good stuff now. So, the focus of the webinar today is, where are we leaving margin behind in our business, right? We know, based on our conversations with clients and then implementing our solutions and seeing results, that the typical convenience retailer is leaving margin on the table. And it's not just, one place where you say, hey, we can flip this switch and increase your margin. What's happening is, we have clients with big retail chains, and they have all these little decision points that have to happen in order to run their business. And at each stage or level, we can identify this margin leak and help to correct it using, digital transformation and software. And so we're going to talk through that a bit today. The reason why this is occurring, though, is because gas, fuel and convenience retail has changed significantly so much over the last, few years, several years. And I think there's a lot of trends going on in gas and retail, but sort of what we see in the market is that, gas stations are so much more than just, grab and go, stock items, get fuel, etc. They're really becoming retail hubs where our customers at these stores fully expect to be able to go in, get their staples, rely on this for everyday goods, and our gas stations have to evolve to really accommodate that need. The way they're evolving is manyfold, but I think three of the big ways they're evolving is, very critically, fresh food, right? The convenience stores that we talk to are putting more and more of an emphasis on the fresh goods category, fresh foods, grab and go options, etc. And this is helping drive traffic in our stores, right? If I'm on the way to work in the morning, I've got to have breakfast, so I pop in and, fuel up, get food, buy some goods, etc. So it's a key driver of margin traffic in our stores, but it's very complex to manage because of perishability, waste, etc. So that's one way. A second thing that we've seen throughout the retail chains that we talk to is an ever increasing assortment that is just expanding over and over with the retailers that we're working with. I think retailers feel like in order to stay competitive, we have to offer more differentiated product and assortment. It's no longer enough to just carry, the staple items that we are used to seeing in convenience stores over the years. But many of our customers are adding regional and local specific products to the range that hopefully further entice those local customers to, make our store their home on the way to work, on the way to school, etc. More SKUs and more assortment, of course, means more complexity, right? And a lower concentration of sales, lower runners, etc., which are very, very difficult to manage and plan. And I think everybody on the call probably knows what I mean by that. Lastly, I think one of the key complexities and transformations that we've seen in the C-store space is an increased reliance on promotions and loyalty programs, et cetera, right? Ways to reward our customers and, earn their repeat business, gain loyalty, is great. And it's a key part of the strategy for the clients that we work with. but it drives a lot of complexity in terms of adopting these methods around promotions or loyalty rewards, but also executing them properly. And it's a really difficult, complex thing to do. And when we've got 50, 100, 200 stores, etc., it can become a real nightmare to manage. And so, we talk about that a lot as well. So in general, I think everything's just getting a little bit harder, both from a process and technology standpoint. The clients that we work with are looking for ways to improve their KPIs, improve their efficiency and productivity, right, by automation, and ultimately make their day-to-day jobs a little bit easier and up to the task of these changes that we just talked about, the challenges in retail that people are experiencing in sort of the new age, and the need for transformation and involvement in order to keep up with these challenges and continue to grow our business and our productivity, et cetera. So what we're going to do today is walk through a few operational scenarios, like real things that we see our customers dealing with related to these challenges. Um, you know how they're managing it today, what the challenge is, the pain, and then Victor will kind of come in and show how we deal with the same situation inside the LEAFIO platform to sort of, in many cases, automate, resolve, and improve the pain that we're experiencing around this. So we've got a few scenarios to go through, and then at the end, of course, we'll talk and do some Q&A around these different topics. All right. So the first scenario we wanted to talk about is sort of this decentralized manual store planning that we see, which I think has a really large impact ultimately on the P&L for the clients that we serve. So, I don't know, Victor and I, we talk with retailers in C-store all the time, and it doesn't matter if we've got, 50 stores, 100 stores, even 200 plus stores. We still run into people that say, yeah, how is ordering done just manually, right? Our store managers, they walk around the store each week and sort of decide what to order based on what they see, what their tribal knowledge is. They plug it into the system and sort of cross their fingers and hope it's correct. So I think the major challenge with this really is that each store manager is doing it a little bit differently, right? We've got Bob in one region who orders to protect availability, but Jim likes to keep a lean store, so he orders much less. So at the end, Bob has overstocks, Jim has shortages, and neither of them really can consider the complexity that comes along with, market demand trends, seasonality, upcoming promotions, supplier issues, all that stuff, right? And the outcome is really that we have a very fragmented replenishment process that results in variable store performance, overstocks in places where we don't need it, lost sales in other places where we don't need or where we need units, perishable waste, and a lot of manual work as well, right? These are our store managers. We're relying on them to do a lot of manual work in order to replenish our stores. So, Victor.
Yeah. And this can have a huge impact on the P&L, right? Especially across a really large network of stores. You're wasting a lot of time on manual processes to manage inventory, still suffering from that margin loss we talked about. Brad mentioned the lost sales in some situations, overstock inventory costs in others. And so what I want to do is take a look at how companies can transform from those manual fragmented processes into a standardized, automated, and ultimately resilient replenishment system. So I will take over the screen share from you, Brad,
Yes,
and
sir.
take a look at the inventory optimization solution that LEAFIO provides. And so ultimately what our goal is going to be is to keep these indicators down here at the bottom as low as possible. Keep our overstocks as low as we can while preventing as much lost sales as we can. So how do we do that? Well, what our system is designed to do is autonomously build, forecast, and plan for demand, and then ultimately build dynamic stocking buffers for items at the item location level that are going to be resilient enough to effectively manage our demand on an ongoing basis. So it picks up on seasonal trends, promotional aspects, the perishable items that Brad mentioned earlier, etc. And it's really critical for us to manage these at the item location level because my demand for this water at store 2 is going to be different than it is at store 22. The lead time might be different, etc. So we want to manage them independently. And then what we're seeing here is the dynamic nature of the stocking buffer in the background of this chart. And the idea is that as our demand, as our consumption from our customers fluctuates throughout time, the inventory levels will fluctuate in response to that. And so we can see in this example, I've got a yellow line down here at the bottom that is my consumption trend. We call it ADU, or average daily usage. And you can see that as that consumption is shrinking over time, the buffer for this item is shrinking in response to that. As the demand increases, our sales are increasing, the buffer in response will start increasing so that we're always pacing inventories to what that demand is. There are several zones within this buffer. So the green zone that you can see is set to cover essentially how much inventory we're going to need over a given replenishment cycle. But we know that that's not going to be a 100% accurate measure. So we need some extra protection built into this buffer. That's where the yellow and our red zones come into play. They are the safety that's embedded within the buffer. Every single item is going to have a yellow zone, and it's there to protect against volatility. That could be variable demand patterns, that could be variable lead times if my suppliers, whether that's an internal supplier or external supplier, are inconsistent with their deliveries. I need to be protected against that. The red zone is an additional layer of protection that's designed for our critical A items. So items that we never ever want to stock out on, we can add in some additional protection for those. These zones are very similar in concept to a traditional safety stock, the big difference being the dynamic nature of the buffers. And then very critically, the system is automatically going to pick up on how variable an item's demand is, which is going to influence how thick these buffers need to be. So a really steady runner doesn't need too much protection, while a highly variable item needs to have some more protection built into the buffer. The system is automatically going to pick up on that for us and automatically adjust that throughout time. So if a steady runner becomes highly volatile, it's going to adjust that automatically. Again, picking up on those trends faster than a user might be able to just by manual processes. Lastly, within the buffer here, we see a gray zone. That's going to be the amount of product that's actually on the shelf. Brad mentioned our shelf efficiency solution, which builds planograms for our clients. And so we're picking up on those quantities of facings directly from that system and building them into the buffers automatically. And then ideally, what we would see over time is what we see here with this blue line, which shows the actual inventory levels for this item, fluctuating throughout that green zone within the buffer. Occasionally dipping down into the yellow or the red zones, that's perfectly fine. That's what those zones are designed for. But this gives me a really clear vision in terms of how effectively I've been able to manage my inventories over this given time period. And these buffers are calculated automatically. And then when appropriate, they're going to result in order recommendations for us. And so here I can see an example of a new supply order from an external supplier, number 62. This could be from an internal supplier, my own distribution center. So we can structure the supply chain however your supply chain is structured. And then from this supplier, we see all of the the recommended order quantities for given items as of today. Very critically, if I want to optimize this order for whatever reason, maybe I'm trying to keep it under a certain dollar amount or fill a truckload or something like that, we have optimization functionality built into the solution, so I can optimize around the dollar value, the volume, etc. Fill containers, fill truckloads, etc. In this case, maybe I don't want to order $18,000 from this supplier. I only want to order 15,000, and so I can input my target values, optimize, and then the system is going to update the order quantities where it can while still respecting ordering parameters like minimums, multiples, etc. And then slightly adjust the order quantities for each item. Once I'm happy with this, then I can click place checked rows, and then that would generate the corresponding, in this case, purchase order to be sent back to the ERP or the order management system for execution of that transaction. Very critically, I walked through this in kind of a manual process today, but this kind of automation or this kind of optimization and the order generation can be automated and ideally will be automated. So, where we want to get is where the vast majority of our ordering is going to be automated, which frees up a lot of time for our users to be a bit more strategic and focus in on exceptions within their supply chain. So, in this example, I can see that I'm automating 97% of my replenishment, which is very consistent with where most of our clients get. When we first implement with a client, they'll start kind of small, but over time, once they mature and grow in confidence in the system, we have clients automating well above 95% of all of their replenishment.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. I think that's the critical thing. We like to walk through the full functionality to sort of see how the system's working in the background and how these buffers are resilient and liquid, actually changing with our market demand. But the reality for most of our customers is when we log in the morning as planners or purchasers, etc., the planning is already done, right? We walk in, it's already done. My store manager, he or she doesn't have to walk around the store and order anything. And critically, we've standardized the process across our entire retail chain. So, we're getting the same sort of output and results and improvement on KPIs across our chain without having to convince, 55 store managers that we've got a new way of doing this or a new way of planning. And ultimately, it saves time, it improves KPIs, and it allows us to make strategic decisions around planning at a chain wide level, right? So if I make a tweak to the logic, it's going to roll throughout our whole network and just have tremendous benefit there. Okay, thanks, Victor. I will share again, and we'll talk about the next scenario that I think is prevalent and we're seeing more and more of in the market. So second scenario here is really margin that's leaking from perishable products, right? I talked earlier about one of the key challenges that we see retailers facing right now is this increasing need to place fresh and ultra fresh products in their convenience stores, grab and go items, etc., breakfast, lunch, dinner in many cases. I think especially the convenience store near my house, like I'm there several times a week for different grab and go snacks, and it's really hard to manage, right? I think typically we see people ordering more to be safe, right? Standard operating procedure. If we're not sure, we round up a little bit, and that's all well and good while those products are selling, but typically what happens is that at the end of the week or the end of the day when we've got these really ultra fresh items, what we find is that we've got a bunch of expiring perishables on the shelf that didn't go in the relevant time frame. So what happens? That's where shrink occurs, right? We have to write those off. Produce waste, and that really actually eliminates the margin that we've gained by ensuring the availability and protection on those items, right? So the buffer that we've built by ordering more has just really become a source of margin leak. It's not a delivery problem, it's not a supplier problem, it's not a demand problem. The problem is that our replenishment system, whether manual or automated, doesn't typically account for the complexity of these fresh items, both from a perishability standpoint and a demand variation standpoint. Right, Victor?
Yeah, that's right. And so like you said, the issue isn't safety stock that we're building into the buffers like we talked about or anything like that. It's connecting that to the perishability of the item. And so we need to consider the two different problems we have. We don't want to run out, but at the same time, we want to prevent those write-offs. So it just adds that extra layer of complexity, which our system is designed to help effectively manage, just like we looked at a moment ago. So if I could share my screen again.
Sure.
um, Whenever we're building those buffers like we looked at or building the forecast for our items, when we add in the fresh components, it's going to add that extra layer of complexity. So here I've got a list of all of my fresh items. And so along with the demand variation and the other ordering parameters, et cetera, that we have to take into consideration this remaining shelf life for all of the items that are all of our fresh items we're putting into inventory. On top of that, we're going to have fluctuations in terms of our demand, not just on a weekly basis, but a daily basis, and even during different periods of the day, morning versus afternoon versus evening for some items. And so you need a system that's going to be able to take that day of the week variation into consideration and even that intraday planning as well. So when are deliveries coming in for our fresh items? That's going to impact when we need to replenish whatever that schedule is. Can tie into the forecast, of course. So if I look at a forecast for one of those fresh items that we had there, the system, again, is going to autonomously be building this forecast for us. And you'll see the fluctuations of the forecast throughout time. That's going to be tied to the demand variation that we see for these items. And then the forecast is going to input or impact that replenishment process, taking into consideration that day of the week variation, the intraday variation as well. Promotional aspects might be a component of that as well. And so it's all going to add that extra layer of complexity that you really can't manage effectively if you're using a manual process. You need an automated process like we can help enable in the LEAFIO platform to pick up on all of those trends and make adjustments as necessary. And then one of the things I mentioned earlier with the buffers, if I open up a buffer for this item, the volatility impacting those different zones within the buffer. So you can tell that this one looks a little bit different. So we've got thicker yellow zones, thicker red zones on this item than the first one that we looked at. That would be because of the volatility with this item, but it's still going to be taken into consideration the remaining shelf life for the item, taking into consideration the delivery schedule, and then crucially, for our fresh items, we can set target service levels so that we can say we want to maintain a certain level of availability for the items while minimizing our shrink down to a certain or a certain threshold. So we can build that kind of logic in to, again, the system automatically take it into consideration and build it into these buffers for the items, again, at the item location level.
Yeah, very cool. I mean, it's not about, ordering more or less. It's about ordering smarter, right? And really taking into those, account those additional factors. How long do we have until this perishes? What is the intra-week demand variation, right? We can't plan these the same as we plan canned goods because we really need to factor in, well, it sells more on a Tuesday morning than it does on a Friday evening, right? It's a breakfast bar or whatever. And so, the system does a really good job of capturing that and ultimately, you know, reducing waste and increasing availability by really aligning inventory to market demand where it matters. Okay, cool. And I'm going to show again for the next scenario, but just a quick reminder, please, if you have questions about these insights, scenarios, your business, put them in the chat and we'll certainly get to those at the end of the webinar. All right, so that's brilliant. Thanks, Victor. One more scenario I wanted to go through here was this. This is becoming more and more of a topic of conversation with the clients that we talk to, especially in the larger chains, where we've got hundreds or 100 plus stores, 200 stores, etc. It's really the network imbalance of inventory, right? The scenario is very simple. In a simplistic way, we've got one store out here. who's out of their top energy drink and has been out for 3 days, right? So the system is, or their store manager's ordering and ordering, but it's not going to come for, the end of till the end of the week or next week, etc. I've got another store who's over ordered and has way too much, or the demand is softened there, etc. And we really just don't have that visibility or connectivity between the two stores to say, hey, we can help here, right? One store is losing revenue, another store has working capital and space, critically space, locked up in slow moving inventory. And the only thing our traditional system or manual process is going to say is, hey, this store just needs to order more and bring more into our network inventory. When the reality is there's an opportunity here to, that's a very small scale example, but to rebalance inventory amongst our network in a powerful way to avoid bringing more obsolete inventory into our full network.
Yeah, and this happens a lot, especially when um, networks are managed in that fragmented, isolated way. Brad mentioned Bob and Jim, I think, earlier. So Bob has too much inventory, Jim has too little. And so Jim might see that and say, hey, I need to order more from our vendor or order more to my store from the distribution center, when in reality, we can just rebalance across the entire network. And so our system is designed to do that really quite effectively in an automated nature. So when we go through kind of the day in the life, the vast majority of our replenishment, like we talked about, is going to be automated. And the goal of everything we've looked at so far is to keep the right amount of inventory at the right location, whether that's at the store level, the distribution center, etc. But we know that life happens, right? It's not going to be 100% correct all the time. And so we can then look for these areas, these kind of edge cases to get even better performance. And so what I've done here is I've filtered down to look for, I'm looking at one specific location. We could look across our entire chain if we wanted to, but the system is identifying items where we're overstocked in this location, and we might be able to redistribute to other locations that need to be replenished. And it's based on the BTB rate that I'm looking at here, which stands for balance to buffer. Essentially, are we carrying more inventory than we need, relevant or relative to the buffer that we have set up for the items? And so I can find all of these items where we're overstocked. And then I've got the opportunity to redistribute these stocks across our network. I could just distribute the overstocks. I've also got the ability to, let's say we're closing out a store. I can redistribute the entire balance from that store to other stores if I wanted to. But in this case, let's just say we're redistributing all of our overstocks. And so what the system is going to do then is it will analyze the inventory levels across our entire chain and then identify opportunities for us to send our overstocks over to other stores that need to be replenished. I can use my SKU packaging if I want to. I can also redistribute back to the central warehouse. So if I have remaining inventory after that distribution, I've got the opportunity to then send it back to the DC if I want to. And then, just like we talked about earlier, crucially, I can automate this process if I want to. In this case, I'm not going to do that, but we can build that into the automation for our general replenishment process. And so then, based on the analysis that the system is doing here, it's finding all of those items, in this case at store number 2, that I'm overstocked on, identifying other stores that need to be replenished, and then where possible, it's going to generate special orders for me to send from one location to another. It'll take just a moment here to run all of that logic because it's doing a lot of analysis for me. And then once it finds that, you'll see it's generating 5 special orders for me. I'll have the opportunity once it creates those to review those. I can adjust the order quantities if I want to, just like we looked at in the order automation. I can optimize these order quantities if I want to, etc. And then once I'm happy with them, I can then create these special orders, which again, once I generate the orders in our system, it will send those back to the ERP system to create the corresponding transactions. And then one very critical, I think, piece on this is we need to put some guardrails in place here, right? If I'm overstocked by one case of that energy drink in one store, it probably doesn't make logistic sense from a cost standpoint for me to send it over to another store because I'm not that overstocked and it would cost too much just to send that one case. And so we can put those kind of guardrails in place in terms of like minimum count size and the units we want to redistribute or what have you, so that we're staying in our relative balance across our network without incurring unnecessary costs from a logistics standpoint to try to redistribute there.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is something that most retailers and C stores don't really have the ability to execute. Definitely not to automate, right? It's hard enough for them to even manually go through and say, hey, what really should we be transferring from store to store or back to the warehouse, et cetera. And what that does is it just drives a lot more obsolete inventory in your network when you could really rebalance a bit and just save a lot of working capital on purchasing new inventory. So we provide the analysis in an automated fashion, but also the ability to automate it. We say, hey, we want to look at this report once a week, and it's going to recommend to me what I should or should not execute in terms of transferring. So very, very powerful, has a huge impact on the P&L and also our balance sheet in terms of inventory. But in terms of the P&L, it's about creating availability of the products that are selling very, very quickly, right? And preventing those lost sales. All right, let me share my screen again, Victor, and we will press forward. So, yeah, those are sort of the three scenarios that we wanted to walk through today. I think three scenarios that we're hearing in every conversation we have is sort of top of mind for convenience store retailers. So, how do we standardize and automate our store planning process to create results that are, across the chain? Planning fresh inventory to a better degree, right? Really taking into those complex factors and creating a better plan, forecast, and replenishment method for fresh. And then when we have imbalances, right, being able to execute those to move them to different stores, different locations to prevent obsolescence in our network. So these are three things that we do, we hear a lot about, and we correct. But as I said at the beginning, I think the margin loss at C stores, it's happening over all these little micro tactical parts of the business. And there's many, many more things that are driving margin loss that the system and the platform help to overcome. And ultimately, when we start automating these things, start analyzing them, we see tremendous boost in KPIs, reduction of lost sales, reduction in inventory, and then very critical, productivity gains, right? It's a reduction in the human capital required to just stay on top of my 200 locations with 5,000 SKUs, et cetera. Okay, so that's what's really missing is this decision layer, which I just talked about, right? How do we connect these different things together under one platform where we have AI looking at and making decisions for our business? An example, I always like to put in a real life example of a client that leverages, this technology in our process in order to see tremendous results. So one of our great clients, Baltic Petroleum, 86 gas station and convenience stores, 2,500 SKUs, so very, very typical. They've implemented the solution and really had tremendous results in terms of return on investment in a very quick way, right? Sales increased by 62% with availability increasing while decreasing excess inventory to the tune of half. So pretty amazing results there. 9% lost sales decrease and 8% average SKU availability increase. So it's a tremendous thing, but we're actually decreasing our inventory and increasing our availability by aligning inventory with the right market demand and it being able to fluctuate and follow the path of demand over time. So tremendous results there. We can see, or Victor, why don't you explain our simulation? But I think the point is that we can show you sort of what we expect your results to be by using the platform.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important for folks that are thinking about, going through this kind of transformational process to be able to prove that it's going to deliver value to them. So, for that reason, we've designed what we call a simulation. And the simulation is quite simple. We take some historical data on your items. So, we would typically choose, a few hundred of your most critical items, maybe 5 or 10 locations, something along those lines. Then we just need a little bit of item master data, like the item's lead time, MOQs, that sort of thing, and then a year's worth of sales history for those items. And then we can plug that into our system and model what the inventory performance would have been over that time period, given the actual demand you experienced at the item location level. And we can show it at the item location level as well as roll those results up to an aggregate level. And so what we see on the slide here is an example of a simulation that we recently ran for a prospective client. And so we're measuring the results, their actuals over a given time period to what our simulation showed across four key metrics: our lost sales, average inventory levels, service levels, and average overstocks. And so in this example, we saw that from a simulation standpoint, had they been running with our system over this time period, their lost sales would have been X percentage lower. Their inventory levels looks like 15% lower. Service levels or availability would have been higher, and their overstocks would have been much, much lower. And so there are obviously some assumptions that are going to be built into this process, but it does give us a very clear idea of the impact that our solution could make given a client's real experience, real world data.
Yeah, it's also it's super black and white, right? It's like, hey, here's how you planned last year. Here's how we would have planned. Here's the difference, right? Here's the delta. And so it becomes a very black and white conversation, coupled with sort of the automation that the solution creates. It's often a super fun, engaging, and like educational type exercise for our businesses that we work with. So please reach out if you're interested in sort of running one of these simulations. So that concludes the content that we have. We've got a few more minutes, and we do have some questions in our Q&A here, so we're going to go through those. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around and putting in some of these thoughtful questions, and apologize again for the power outage that we experienced. I noticed, Victor, when you were presenting, like in the bottom left of your laptop, you've got like the weather widget,
Yeah.
and it says like wind advisory, like high wind. So, um, you know, just leave it to Atlanta weather to give us crazy wind and down trees in the morning when we have a webinar. But appreciate everybody's patience there. All right, so let's go through some of these questions, Victor. The first question is in the chat. So, what usually changes inside a retailer once these decisions become automated rather than managed through spreadsheets? Victor, why don't you take that?
Yeah, I think one of the first things obviously is the amount of time, the manual work it takes. So a lot of times users are just living in Excel, doing all of these manual calculations, or in many cases, we talk to C-store clients where their store managers are just they're eyeballing their inventories on the shelf, and so like Brad talked about earlier, that's very time consuming and just a very fragmented, non-standardized way of doing things. And so the first thing is the reduction of the amount of time it takes, which is frees up their time to be more strategic. So one of the things, especially within our solution, is by automating this process, there's a tremendous amount of analytics and reporting available. So rather than doing those kind of manual calculations, gives you time to focus in on the analytics and search for the exceptions, search for the problem areas, and then be strategic about what you can do to resolve those problems. Just a quick example that I see a lot are we can track the reasons for lost sales, like suppliers were late with their deliveries or simply didn't deliver the products that we ordered. And so we can find those kinds of issues and work to resolve them. So saving time, focusing in on the real priorities instead of just that kind of manual calculation in spreadsheets.
Yeah, there's so much more I think we could say about that, the benefits that we see from people, automating these processes. But it's a very good overview, and I'd love to discuss that more with you. Okay, great. Next question. How does the platform actually connect decisions between okay, so this is a question about, I sort of showed the platform that we offer and we focused on inventory today. Questions around how does, it connect between the replenishment and the supply chain side with promotions, shelf execution, et cetera. And I'll speak to this. So I think one of our huge, messages when we talk to clients is, we intend to connect the supply chain and merchandising process and technology for clients that we serve. And we believe there's a tremendous benefit from doing this. Typically, clients that we talk to, they have disconnected, teams and technology and process for these two sides of the business. And the reality is that it becomes a really cumbersome manual process and challenging to actually execute the decisions that merchandising makes, because they're not connected. So if I change, for instance, I make a decision and make a change to the assortment, right? How does that flow to the store in order for the store to update the shelf with the new assortment, right? How do we measure compliance in the store there? Also, how does that flow into our replenishment process, where I've got to turn off the replenishment at those stores where I'm changing assortment for the old item, add the new item, update the central warehouse values in some cases, et cetera. It becomes a really, really big challenge for companies to deal with. And by connecting these platform elements, every decision that I make on one side or the other flows to the other side of the business. And it really drives a lot of automation and synergy between different elements of our supply chain merchandising process. At the same time, we need to know how many facings we have on the shelf, which is connected in our planogram solution to plan inventory properly. So we always have sort of that minimum shelf stock of the number of facings. So again, another one of many use cases where the platform becomes very, very powerful. Okay. Another question, Victor, maybe time for a couple more. In projects like this, where would we see the fastest financial impact, waste reduction, availability improvement, or labor savings?
I'd say that really depends on where
Yeah.
you are today. We can see improvements in all of those, but if you're a lot of times clients will be really overstocked, meaning they're not really suffering from availability issues, but they're tying up capital in product that's not moving. That ties into the waste for perishable items. And so we would typically see in that kind of environment, reduction of those overstocks, reduction of that waste, et cetera, while maintaining high availability. Whereas sometimes clients are in the exact opposite scenario where they don't have the correct demand signals. So they don't really know what they need to have on the shelf. So they're suffering with availability issues. So in that instance, we might see inventories go up, but that makes sense because then that brings their lost sales way down. So where companies typically see the fastest results really just depends on where they are today. Where do they need to see the improvements? The labor savings for sure. The automation we typically see in any scenario a lot of reduction in the amount of time it takes to go through this process.
Yeah, totally agree. It really depends, of course, as does everything. But I think benefits across all scenarios there. All right, last question we'll have time for today. How does the system handle very short shelf life products like fresh food prepared in the store, or stuff with daily deliveries? Can the forecast adapt fast enough? Certainly can. I think this is one of the really powerful things about the solution when we have fresh goods, is that we have to adapt to it fast enough in order to prevent those stockouts while protecting availability. In the solution, we actually are considering for daily deliveries, like you mentioned, we're even considering the time of day in which those deliveries occur, right? Because when you have an ultra fresh product that's highly perishable, it matters whether it is received in the morning, in the afternoon, or overnight, right? And so those kinds of things, or it's data that we use in the system to make sure we're planning for those goods appropriately and replenishing those goods appropriately. And certainly in terms of the forecast and the buffer logic, we are adapting fast enough because the forecast, the buffer, the weekly variation ratios that Victor talked about, they're constantly evolving with changes in demand, right? So no 2 days are the same, and our algorithms and forecasts are constantly working to catch up to align themselves to market demand, and it can adapt fast enough. These items obviously have very, very short lead times in almost all scenarios. And because of those short lead times, it means that we can adjust the logic, or that the logic will adjust itself and replenish itself to adapt fast enough, just via the short lead times that we have. Okay. Cool. Well, thanks everybody. I think there's a few more questions, but we can respond to those sort of via email with our team after the webinar. Thanks so much. We've got a great audience and number of folks here, so we very, very much appreciate your time. Please reach out to us with questions, or if you'd like to see a simulation of your business's data, we're certainly happy to facilitate that. Apologize one more time for our power outage in our brief intermission there in the webinar, but thanks for everybody for sticking around. And thanks, Victor, for the presentation. I think it was a lot of fun, and we will see you guys next time.
Thanks so much, everyone. Hope to talk to you soon.
Cheers.